So I think this has become a foundational element today, that people on the building side have to be very conversant with architectural choices that have to be made. And a third element, in the last few years of my experience, Sahamati and now Finvu, the interesting definition of scale is actually reliability across organizational borders. I mean, in the first and the second, it was still largely closed loop systems. You're building systems which reside within a certain domain of an organization. At best, you're building some integrations with a few other parties. But now, internet style delivery of service has become the norm. And, in the Sahamati experience that I had and what's happening, like you said, in India's financial infrastructural transformation, digital public infrastructure has basically made it mandatory that every transaction is architected or designed as a cross-border, so to speak, transaction, right? Where in one single transaction, I will have to actually seamlessly transcend boundaries of maybe 5 organizations, right? And it has to be reliable across those boundaries. So I think reliability, internet style, an internet style for me means, as a user, I frankly don't know how this website is delivering whatever is delivering. I don't know where it's going. But that is a very key foundational element.
Welcome to a new episode of Observability Talk. Our guest today is Vamsi Madhav. Vamsi is the CEO of Finvu, a RBI licensed NBFC account aggregator. Before he went into this entrepreneurial journey, he was the Chief Operating Officer of Sahamati, working towards setting up an open banking ecosystem in India. He has over 2 decades of experience and has worked in organizations like Mahindra Comviva, Vsoft Technologies, and OneMoney. In this episode, I am excited to talk to Vamsi on his journey, and we will deep dive on his perspective on digital transformation, customer experience, the role of observability when formulating a business strategy, and perhaps one of my favorite topic of exploration, is observability becoming a meeting agenda in boardroom conversations? Thank you so much, Vamsi, for joining us today on Observability Talk podcast.
Thank you, Bharat. Always been a pleasure, and it's a privilege being given this opportunity.
Vamsi, India is witnessing a groundbreaking innovation in the financial services. You have been closely involved in building certain citizen-scale platforms, like at Mahindra Comviva, Sahamati, and now at Finvu. It would be fantastic to get your perspective on these foundational elements in building systems at scale.
The question, Bharat, actually has been quite thought-provoking for me, frankly, because it sort of forced me to go back and frame my experience as a builder. And, my background, just for your audience, is I have been in the tech industry, but I have not built tech the way traditional, definitions of that would mean. I have been on the business side and on the product side. I was a business analyst to begin with, learned a lot of technology jargon and concepts from much more erudite friends of mine, and always enjoyed discussing the concept of scale, right? And of course, over the years, having been in product companies, one then becomes obliged to deliver scale in terms of metrics that business folks at the other end measure. So it was interesting for me to figure out what would the foundational elements be, reflecting on those. And I perhaps, would like to frame it as 3 different definitions of scale that I personally experienced. In the initial days of my career, scale meant resilience to time. So we would build systems, let's say, for banks. And, what one would have to build is that if the people building it changed, the team members changed, everything
Right.
that's loaded in had to be maintainable. So maintainability was sort of a key word, and you had to be resilient to the changes that time brings about in who's building it, right?
Right.
Um, this was the pre-Mahindra Comviva. So I used to work for a company called Vsoft, where we built a lot of systems for financial institutions in the US and in India and so on. At Comviva, I really saw a new definition of scale, which was to do with building for availability. Mahindra Comviva's products that I was a part of building was to build mobile wallet systems that were
Right.
deployed in over 70 countries. And I think the largest telecom companies in each country would be the users, and usage patterns and seasonalities would suddenly become the new problem to be resilient to. And the foundational element here, unlike the first part where maintainability meant really good design as a foundational element, right? I mean, first
Right.
principles of OOPS, uh, being very modular in how you think, getting relationships right, those were sort of critical success factors. But when it came
Right.
to the foundational element of building resilience to usage behavior and volume and variety of usage patterns, architectural decisions became a foundational element. So at this time was the era of microservices architecture becoming the key thing.
Right.
The cloud was suddenly the new fancy shining object. Concepts like auto scale and being cloud native. So I think this has become a foundational element today, that people on the building side have to be very conversant with architectural choices that have to be made. And a third element in the last few years of my experience, Sahamati and now Finvu, the interesting definition of scale is actually reliability across organizational borders. I mean, in the first and the second, it was still largely closed loop systems. You're building systems which reside within a certain domain of an organization. At
Right.
best, you're building some integrations with a few other parties. But now, internet style delivery of service has become the norm. And, in the Sahamati experience that I had and what's happening, like you said, in India's financial infrastructural transformation, digital public infrastructure has basically made it mandatory that every transaction is architected or designed as a cross border, so to speak, transaction, right? Where
Oh,
in one
yeah.
single transaction, I will have to actually seamlessly transcend boundaries of maybe 5 organizations, right?
Right.
And it has to be reliable across those boundaries. So I think reliability, internet style, an internet style for me means, as a user, I frankly don't know how this website is delivering whatever is delivering. I don't know where it's going, but that is a very key foundational element. So I think, in summary, Bharat, to your question, as I reflected, I think the foundational elements for builders now more than ever are actually a combination of all three. You've got to build systems that are highly maintainable, that are
Very
highly
true.
available, and now highly reliable across organization boundaries.
No, very, very true. I mean, these are something which has been the mantra for somebody who is building large distributed systems, right? I mean, uh,
Correct.
uh, some of these things are like forever, right? You whenever you want to build something which is really large, which is something very useful, you have to make sure that it is modular, maintainable, available, reliable, and
Absolutely.
resilient is what you mentioned, right? The first one, which was very, very important.
Mm.
One other thing I just want to extend this to further. When you say reliable or available, are you also looking at it more from a customer perspective? When you say reliability or availability, from which gives them much more, let's say, a trust, a better user experience, and make sure that they are fully confident that yes, when they did the transaction, it will definitely go through. So, are you connecting these two parts using these words?
Absolutely. In fact, I think the shift that I have experienced and continue to experience is, to your point, these evergreen problems were always problems for builders. But consumers were largely in a world where the consumption of the service was maybe physical, with the digital being in the back office, or at best phygital, with part physical, part digital. Some of these, elements were not direct expectations of consumers in the past. But now,
Right.
with everything becoming digital first, um, I think what we are seeing both as consumers ourselves, that our tolerance and patience for latency problems in how a service is delivered to us is going down by the day, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
it's a very funny thing that on the one hand, we actually have the power of not shifting from the chair that I am in and getting everything delivered to me. So, how much convenience can one want? On the other hand, I am actually far less patient when I'm consuming things digitally than if
Correct.
I'm forced to go and stand in line somewhere. I mean, and so I think to your point, availability and the lack of it, my propensity to shut down an app if it takes more than a few seconds to be available, right? Or if it is not available to me at the time when I want it, it could be midnight, it could be early morning when I'm driving to the airport. I need all systems to be highly available and, you know, very little latency. And so I
Right.
think these are sort of first principles now in terms of how we define consumer expectations. Absolutely.
Right, right. So if you look at, right, that you talked about that you have been working on software product from different uh, angles and different set of people, and you have developed certain products for BFSI and fintech vertical, and somewhere you have a unique view of how digital transformation affects customer experience. The thing which you just talked about. Um, uh, you have seen other companies also getting into this journey of digital transformation, right? So, what do you think are the key elements for some of these enterprises or companies to get this right, to meet the evolving expectations of today's customers? Like you said, right, that uh, we are becoming very impatient. India, in fact, I was reading a report. I was saying that we are the most young country, right, in the world today, who have access to mobile as well as digital payment applications and so on, right? So what sort of things or key elements these enterprises has to get right to make sure that they are able to meet these evolving expectations of today's customers?
Firstly, Bharat, let me perhaps, for the sake of your audience, describe where my viewpoint has been formed from, because
Yeah.
it's easy to have opinions without having a lot of relevant experience these days. uh, in the last 5 years, to your point, I've had the unique opportunity perhaps of actually talking to literally hundreds of financial service providing institutions,
Right.
and I think that observation of how the modern community of builders is looking at things is what is going to drive whatever I say now. Not so much
Right.
what's happened in the past, where we were all building, technology as part of kitchens that were, very closed and talking to
Right.
individual buyers at the other end. I think there are broadly, what I am seeing, Bharat, is that three things have to typically come together, and two of those are where I think differentiation today lies for building unique digital first businesses. I think the hardest thing increasingly, which is becoming harder by the day, is getting the view as to who the targeted user and buyer is. I think research, I mean, with digital, it's actually fairly easy to build a business where the definition of building is just having something launched. I mean,
Right.
today, the ability to copy fast a feature that somebody else has built and
Right.
engineer something that is good enough for a few people is easy, but to build a sustainable digital first business, I'm seeing increasingly many people becoming smarter and more anal on product market fitment in terms of finding the right problem and the right persona to chase, because that's
Right.
very subjective. It is almost very artistic and very, sort of um, qualitative in terms of a decision that the business makes. This is part one, deciding who the user is and what problem is to be solved. And the reason I say that is I think we still see a lot of businesses and builders wanting to build everything for everyone simply because they don't know where the right monetization for them will be, and that always sort of becomes a problem. On the other hand, I've come across several smart savvy builders that I'm envious of because they have the ability to say no, and they say, no, I will only do this, and I'm very clear as to why. And so that's sort of critical. The second part is where we see a lot of activity, and unfortunately, this is becoming commoditized, which is the whole development and DevOps activity of building a feature, iterating on UX, building workflows. Yes, there is a lot of work to be done here to get stuff right, and observability in terms of iterating fast on this element. You roll out a feature, do you have enough observability in place to see what's happening?
Correct.
And in a digital world, unlike physical, gathering this feedback can be quite hard if you haven't engineered for it, right? I mean,
Very true.
and we still find a lot of businesses that claim to be digital first. I have the problem too as a builder still, where we haven't yet engineered observability natively into our building of products features. But this is relatively easy to do. The third element, which I think is where there is still a lot of darkness for the rest of the world and consumers, is where magic happens, which is the engineering side of things, right? There are decisions taken in terms of very deep tech that is driving a lot of the magic that consumers see, the simplicity. And those engineering decisions in terms of architecture design and a lot of the observability and non-functional it is being engineered
Mm-hmm.
are where I'm seeing some businesses and teams really do a great job. And I think in the last decade, we've seen success stories out of the consumer internet companies that have really scaled up, right? I mean, in
True.
India, there are so many, globally, there are so many. We are seeing a lot of their best practices becoming native to how builders of today are thinking about. And so
Right.
I think those three elements have to come together to
No,
build a
I
great
think you,
business.
one thing I straightforward want to ask you post this and description of whatever you said, right? Um, Looks like most of the people have this observability as an afterthought. Is if I say this statement, is it what
Mm.
would you say? Is it true or false or somewhere in between?
No, 100%. I think people realize the the lack of it more than they appreciate the need for it, and therefore, and they always realize the lack of it when they're hit by a problem, uh, and then
Nice.
everybody goes slapping the back of their heads or other people's heads, saying, "Oh, we should have had this." Almost, and like you
Correct.
very correctly said, it's an afterthought, and people realize the need for it. But I, I really think that we are now at a point, and I know later in the conversation you will sort of touch upon it. We are now at a point where this realization is coming front and center in
Right.
conversations, but largely it has been an afterthought.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Vamsi, for those insights. Vamsi, you have done amazing amount of work at Sahamati, right? In enabling adoption of account aggregator framework for financial inclusion, and it has been very inspiring. When I met you first, when you were part of Sahamati, and we were very excited about how this whole account aggregator concept will change the face of how people take loans and how they will be able to get these things going. In fact, I when I applied for loan some time back, I could actually do that through Perfios account aggregator, right? I just want you to take maybe 30 seconds and explain this concept, because what we have realized when I talk to people, what we have realized is that there are still a lot of people who do not fully understand what this account aggregator framework is about and how it will basically be helping people.
No, Bharat, I think you're absolutely right that this is not something that has yet touched the awareness levels that we wish it had. So I will try my best. 30 seconds is a tough timeline, but I'll try to I'll try my best to explain it. I think the easiest way that perhaps consumers would understand, like you said, is each one of us perhaps at some point does take a loan
Right.
or does seek advice from maybe our investment advisors or our chartered accountants. And at some point in that sort of conversation, we are asked uh, either our bank statement or a statement of where our investments currently lie. And that micro transaction in the whole conversation that we have usually becomes the longest activity in that transaction, because I will then say, oh, wait, I will have to go to my net banking application and download my statement. I'll do it over the weekend. Or I say, oh, you
Right.
want my holdings information? Let me sit down with my wife and over the weekend figure out where we have, what all we have, and then I'll give it. So,
Right.
this act of actually giving one's financial information to a potential lender or a potential advisor actually has ramifications that are not seen. And those ramifications are I may just drop off from the whole conversation. I may decide to go to suboptimal, you know, options, which are maybe higher priced and not the best offers, but simply because, somebody's coming home and either forcing me to give the information right then and there, and they just end up, giving that information to that person. So the act of gathering and sharing
Right.
information actually has become a problem over the years, both for consumers and even more so for the lenders and the advisors. So, Account Aggregator has tried
Right.
to bring together a digital solution to this problem. And much like how identity verification has been solved by Aadhaar over the years,
Maybe.
how
Right.
payment transactions has been so brilliantly solved by UPI over the years, the act of me being able to give my bank statement, just like I give my money, digitally to somebody else who wants it, is what account aggregator is. And the central term that really is a better descriptor than even the term account aggregator is consent manager.
Right.
Because I think what is central to this and what we as account aggregators do, I represent one of India's leading account aggregators called Finvu account aggregator, one of the earliest, and we are trying to be what I call India's most reliable account aggregator. By the way, reliability is a key word that we have adopted, and I know you will perhaps like it given your focus on
Yeah.
observability. So what we do is
Right.
we provide interfaces to citizens to give consent, and we then
Right.
act as plumbers connecting the citizens' banks and wherever else the citizens' data may lie to the destinations that the citizen wants the data to go to, which could be other banks, lenders that are NBFCs, investment advisors under SEBI. And so there is a network today of about 500 plus institutions that,
Right.
thanks to the efforts of the Sahamati community, and by the way, while you credited me very kindly, I must say that all the effort has been actually of players like yourselves, the technology vendors, the financial institutions, who brought together implementations, right? And of course, the regulators, because the
Right.
regulators way back in 2016 laid the rails in terms of the specifications and the master directions. So, we've just put our shoulders to the wheel. But the
Right.
point is that citizens today, over 100 million of them, have successfully used this rail to conduct that microtransaction. So, like you said, you went for a loan and you were able to use Perfios to do that. Similarly, millions of citizens, over 20 million of them on our platform, actually use Finvu AA to conduct that microtransaction of giving their data, be it a bank statement, be it
Right.
their Demat account statement or their mutual funds or what have you.
Right.
So that's what account aggregator does as a concept.
That's very interesting. I mean, I think most of the people will listen to this podcast only to understand account aggregator, what it does and how it really does that. Right. Thank you so much. Uh, One of the things which we were discussing when we were working together at Sahamati, right? One of the biggest challenge you had or you had to overcome was having a trust based user experience, right? Because as you rightly said that people are a little finicky about giving their account information or sharing their account details or account statement and so on, right? But so you had to do certain things to make sure that people trust the system, right? Or you sort of give such sort of a user experience for that. What are the steps you took to overcome this challenge, right? And my question is again a little more self this thing, that does real time monitoring and visibility have had any role in this?
So, Bharat, and your audience deserves to know the great work that I think VuNet did. Thanks to the discussions that we had, because there was a real problem, and there continues to be. Of course, the problem is not solved, and we need to keep chipping away at it. The problem is actually a consequence of what we said at the start. I mean, today the transaction crosses boundaries of organizational domains. But trust doesn't easily cross those boundaries. I mean, you went to take a loan, you perhaps fundamentally trust the bank where you've kept your money for several years. Yeah.
Right.
You perhaps trust the lender, and which is why you're going to the lender in the first place. But in between, there are these new kids on the block called an account aggregator that you perhaps don't even know of.
Right.
And they're unknown to you. Maybe few other parties, maybe there is a Sahamati that nobody knows of in the consumer world by design,
Correct.
but they do
Right.
have a role to play in terms of offering some meta information for the transaction to go through.
Right.
So the problem is that today expectations of consumers are that everything will happen in a jiffy, but that everything should happen crossing transactional boundaries that organizational domains have.
Right.
And what I have realized is that whether it is builders or consumers, while we may be impatient with respect to latency, we are actually even more impatient if there is no transparency of why something is going wrong, if it is going wrong.
Right.
So, what we attempted to solve, with your help, was bring in transparency first, which is basically to say, can each of the organizations that is involved in the fulfillment
Right.
have a transparent, uh, you know, uh, status of where a certain transaction is in terms of the metrics that are relevant, right?
Correct.
The response time of a certain API call, the error codes or the success codes that the API call resulted in the systems, and bring it all together in a format that can be consumed first by the builders in the network, and
Right.
then ultimately by consumers themselves who are using those front end interfaces that the builders are offering. So I think what was very critical, and even more so because of this distributed sort of transaction fulfillment ecosystem,
Right.
is that we need to have transparency as a first solution. Right? I mean, once we make transparency a value, I think everybody is highly technically competent to solve their respective ends of the problem. The issue was and continues to be that people say, I don't really know what the problem is. Forget, what the solution is. I don't even know what the
Right.
problem is, right?
Correct.
And so that's what we attempted to solve. And I think, we came a certain distance, but,
Right.
much more is to be done.
No, I completely agree. Because today also when we talk to a lot of our banking customers, right, one of the biggest challenge they see with their end customer is if it start buffering or if it start taking more time, the
Yeah,
end customer's transaction, people are generally, like you said, right, that people are impatient, so they are trying to maybe click on buttons, cancel, oh it is not going, and what will happen to my money and all sort of thing, right? And if
correct,
banks become more transparent by giving them very quick view in terms of whether it really happened, not happened, and their money is safe and so on, right? uh, it will automatically build trust, right, like
absolutely.
what you were trying to say. So that I think is one of the main reason why people, at least the enterprises which we are working with, also have started doing observability more from the business perspective,
Hmm.
bringing in more transaction level view rather than looking at more uh, machinic view, as in my server is doing good or my application is doing good. More than that,
Hmm.
people have now started moving towards how my transactions are doing good. Are they
Correct,
failing? Where they are failing? Is my customer getting impacted? And so on,
correct.
right? Now if you look at it from BFSI perspective, right, one of the thing which we have been told by a lot of our customers, that there are a lot of regulations, right, and there are a lot
Hmm.
of compliances which each of these enterprises, whether it's a startup or whether it is a fintech or whether it is an NBFC and so on, right, that they need to make sure that they comply to, right?
Yeah.
uh, in this highly regulated sort of compliance driven industry, how do you see observability aligning
Hmm.
with compliance and these regulatory requirements? Just to add to this, we have been told by a lot of our banking customer, at least, that RBI mandates to in certain set of application that there should be you should keep the transaction data for X number of years, right? So I am
Correct.
bringing it this question from that side, and what is your views around this?
I think Finvu A, as you know, is an NBFC, and I'm in this role, I'm obviously experiencing a more direct sort of influence of regulations on our business. And
Right.
I think my sense is that, over the years, whenever any of us participated in audits, that dreaded word, I think the most significant item that we would always be asked to present was evidence of a certain process being followed, right? And I think now that is again becoming front and center, because in the digital world, and with RBI so strongly promoting various kinds of digital ecosystems, evidence of cyber security norms being followed,
Right.
or evidence of um, grievance redressal systems in a digital world being highly available and highly functional, um,
Right.
evidence of data privacy rights of citizens being respected through logs of who is accessing what item of information in which system.
Right.
I think this has just sort of, I would say, magnified in terms of importance in today's world. And so we are seeing this, that there are regulatory reportings that each one of us has to do, um, and it is increasingly becoming more granular. The information sought, the monitoring that we are expected to do, is increasingly becoming more and more granular. And so, to your
Right.
point about retention of data, uh, I think, and this is a thought that just struck me, our email servers have sort of mastered the art of retention of data about
Right.
a decade ago, right? And in the initial days, we would all be subject to certain, constraints of how long.
Right.
Today, it's just always available, and I can always go back, right, to whatever.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I
Yes.
think we perhaps have to be prepared for using the best the technology has to offer. Storage costs are going down. We can no longer complain about costs.
Correct.
Observability systems are becoming more and more modern, and we should speak a little bit about that. The regulatory needs, therefore, can no longer be brushed off as cannot do, right? I mean, we will have to now do it because increasingly, as you well know, the latest flavor of this season is fraud. And in a digital world, I think we are seeing, we ourselves, I must say that a lot of my time now, Bharat, in this role is actually going in investigating grievances that come. And I'm only one part of a multi domain transaction, right? I mean, in fact, in many ways, our role is far limited because we
Correct.
are a data blind digital courier company, if you will.
Right.
But we have to respond like our regulators would want us to respond. We are regulated in order to protect the interests of the citizen.
Right.
So a lot of my time goes in investigating through logs what is exactly happening for a certain consumer, what has happened. And I cannot put boundaries of time there. I can't say, okay, this was 6 months ago, so I don't know, right? So we will have to do far more smarter logging. We will have to do retention of data for as much time as is required by the citizen, not even the regulator.
Right.
And of course, there will be some practical limitations, but increasingly those are becoming only oriented towards more time and not less time, right? You will have to sort of, like you said, RBI says 7 years. I mean, somebody may question saying why not even longer than that? And so
Right. Right.
I think this is absolutely critical, even more now for regulated entities
Right.
and even unregulated entities, because the outsourcing norms from RBI for technology vendors are becoming, even sharper and clearer than they were before. So it is absolutely critical for everybody.
No, I think one thing I also felt the way you described this, right? Looks like this will also help citizens or end users
Yeah, yeah,
much more confident in the system. That is one of the reason why these regulations, compliances are put in place, right? So that they
absolutely.
RBI or regulators can actually give more confidence to the user that his or her transactions, money, or whatever else it is, right? Information is being used in
Absolutely.
the right way, right? So
I think just to add to that, consumers themselves are demanding such history and evidence of us having recorded who's
right,
done what,
correct,
because they also want to trust at the same time. Because of fraud, everybody is wary of whether they are being sort of gamed by someone, right? So consumers are demanding proof and evidence and support, reliability. And in our business, just to sort of amplify the point, a lot of my time is going actually in internal systems that we have,
correct,
because our support team depends on those systems being easy to use. Because when a consumer comes to our support channels, and increasingly we all have real-time support channels, right? Email is
right,
an async channel, but many of us have WhatsApp, and so
right,
again, support has become a low latency expectation. I ask a question, I
correct,
need an answer right now.
right,
So our support team needs highly available log systems which are easily queryable, which are easily usable,
very true,
and those have to give information that can be framed back in terms the consumer can understand. So I think uh, regulators are demanding, as you very correctly said, because consumers are demanding, and it is necessary to build trust at scale. 100%.
right, right. Just I taking the same point further. We talked about that systems are becoming modern, right? And the modern systems would require a modern approach to
Absolutely.
observability, right? Um, and you seems to have been working on these citizen scale systems, right, in the past. Um if you are going to choose an observability system or a platform, what would be your key expectations from it?
Three expectations, Bharat. Having thought through this, thanks to your question prior to this, I think the hardest problem today is root cause analysis. It always has been hard. And in a distributed system, it is even harder. So a modern system that is able to actually, make that hard problem simple
Right.
by crashing the time it takes to isolate which was the weakest link in the chain would be the first, system expectation.
Right.
The second is, I think, the presentation of an actionable metric. I think a lot of systems throw a lot of information, but then it is left to humans in the loop to figure out which of these is the real actionable metric and which of these isn't, right?
Right.
And so I think systems that are able to sort of acquire the intelligence of what is the decision maker wanting, because in most cases the action is to be taken by someone who understands more of the pain point of the consumer but not so much technology, right?
Right.
And so while you will always have the tech folks available to make sense, decision times have to be crashed. And so systems that are able to abstract out a lot of the complexity and isolate not only the root cause system but the root cause metric that has to be actioned, that would be number two. And I
Right.
think the number three system is that the observability system has to be available to me when I want it, not available for me to go to in a different place. What I mean by that is a very friendly and highly available observability system is required, because I have had situations where somebody has woken me up, you know, outside office hours, either early in the
Right.
morning or later, because consumers are using it all the time.
Right.
And we promise 4 nines and we promise all kinds of SLAs in our business, but our systems are still not geared towards that sort of high availability. And when a grievance is there and we need to respond, it is
Right.
the observability system, the modern observability system, that has to suddenly become the most intelligent, highly available system. So, alerting systems, being able to push alerts in channels that I am on, right? Just
Right.
like we push our services to channels that consumers are on,
Right.
whether it's WhatsApp or whatever. So, I think a highly friendly, highly available system in terms of distribution of that actionable metric is sort of the third key criteria. Those would be my criteria.
No, thank you so much. I think somebody would have asked me what VuNet does. I might have at least mentioned all three of them which you mentioned,
Right.
right? And in the IT operations world, right, if you look at RCA or probable RCA is sort of a holy grail, right?
Absolutely.
Everybody is trying to figure out how do we provide a sort of probable RCA or final RCA if they can for any problems which are happening in the system, right? So I
Correct.
think you are bang on from the three. The only last point which I will add, which I was talking about some time back, people have started, at least the customers whom we have talked to, have started talking about the business context part, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
The monitoring platforms used to be quite horizontal in nature, right? They
Correct.
basically will give you a lot more machinic information like, okay, CPU utilization is high or disk utilization is high or my DB is having slow queries and
Mm.
all, but they do not attach it to a business context. So
Correct.
in today's environment, at least the information which our customers are giving us, they are saying no, they are looking at business observability, not only the
Absolutely.
monitoring part, right?
And just to amplify your point and perhaps reiterate the actionable metric for the decision maker. Like I said,
Right.
the
Right.
decision maker is someone who understands the consumer world, not so much the technology. And so the actionable metric has to be presented in those terms, which is, I
Right.
think, saying the same thing that you were a little differently, because the
Right.
metric is no longer, hey, what is the CPU usage? The metric
Correct.
is something that is maybe in terms of how has latency, deteriorated in the last 30 minutes, right? And
Exactly.
what is the consumer experience metric that we should look at? So,
Right.
fully in alignment that a modern system has to speak the language of decision makers, not the internal builders.
Exactly.
and it has to make it available to decision makers
Right.
in quick time so that they are able to take action.
Just taking this little further again, now that we have defined what we expect from an observability system or platform, uh, in your current role or in your previous roles, uh, would you try building an observability platform yourself, or would you prefer buying it from a OEM vendor? And what will basically what sort of points will basically move you from one direction to another?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I suppose, there's no one size fits all to that,
Definitely.
because decisions of build versus buy come from various angles. But, let me give you my thought given my context, right? I think
Yeah.
um, increasingly we are being pushed to spend most of our time on what drives our revenue or what drives our sort of business goals, right? And
Correct.
increasingly I think in the world that we are in, which is loosely what we can term as fintech, I am seeing that getting sharper on um, acquiring customers, and in the enterprise B2B fintech world that I inhabit,
Hmm.
I think you know finding out the motivations for the buyers uh, who buy enterprise software or who sign up services like ours, engaging with them to co-create use cases,
Right.
engaging with them to understand their revenue drivers and monetization drivers is where I should be spending more of
Correct.
our team's time in. So in
Definitely.
that sense, um, we don't get paid for building the best observability system ourselves, right? We will.
Completely understand.
It's a means to our end. So
Correct.
perhaps in our case, we will look for best in class systems that do this, and because these are costs that we must incur so that we can actually deliver value, and we spend more of our time in what we can be uniquely different vis-a-vis
Right.
our peers and our competitors, right? So
Definitely.
in our case, we will perhaps look to getting expertise from outside, right? But there are certain things that we would still want because we are a tech team ourselves. We are, a lot of fintech is also like there are some core assets, for example, that even from a regulatory standpoint, we should entirely own. I
Right.
mean, it's a risk from a regulation perspective to outsource anything that's core in terms of our activity. So, for example,
Correct.
the activity of consent management and the activity of allowing sharing of data through the rails that follow the
Right.
protocol that the regulator has laid out, that tech we own. And so the observability of the core elements
Right.
of what we build, significant parts of that we would still have to build in house.
Right.
But there are several pieces that we build over and above the core, whether it is in our front end client interfaces, where a lot of the consumer experience is
Right.
actually there. The
Correct.
analytics that help us refine user experience is
Mm.
entirely left by regulators as an innovation topic. And so there we may want to build best in class, or rather in source from experts such as yourselves, observability systems that help drive
Right.
a lot of that. So
Right.
that would be how I look at it, Bharat.
Right. No, so this is something which we have been also talking to a lot of our customers, though our customers are little larger banks and so on, and they do have
Correct.
their tech team. One other thing what we have been telling them is that their data part, maybe they need to make it much more internal, that how do you collect the data, but
Yeah.
once you send the data out, then you need a system which can actually correlate, contextualize the data which is coming in from x number of machines, maybe something which is not in your boundary also, I mean within
Correct.
your application boundary, maybe some other application it is talking to, and so on, right? So that you can get a
Correct.
unified end-to-end picture, right? So that's what we generally talk about from that perspective.
Correct.
One of the interesting thing which we have been, at least I've been talking to almost every host or every guest which we basically bring into the podcast, uh, because most of these people have been either on the boards or have been working with the boards in their roles, right? And I am very interested to know if and when the conversation around observability comes up in the boardrooms. Does it come up often, or is it like people have started talking about it now because of whatever things or challenges we discussed earlier? What is your experience around it?
Uh, I'm perhaps not as experienced in that sort of domain. I am My experience is relatively recent, but what I do see is a couple of things. I think the lexicon in boardrooms has become far more technical than one would actually expect it to be. I mean, I think boardrooms, regardless of the background of board members,
Right.
are all talking digital, are all talking API, are all talking experience of consumers. So I think boardrooms are becoming digital first in that sense as well, right?
Very true.
And therefore, the second point, which is risk, which is largely what boardrooms are concerned with. I mean, largely,
Correct.
at least the few conversations I've been a part of, we largely end up discussing, of course, growth strategies for the company as one component. But the second component, immediately, particularly for regulated businesses like ours, is how are you dealing with risk? And it goes back to the point we discussed earlier. Recently I had a conversation with a board member of ours, and the entire conversation was centered around how do we mitigate or how do we prevent, risk that may stem from various sources. And because we're in the business of handling data and we are in the digital sort of public infra business, all the elements you just said, your big banks are talking to you about, where the conversation point, saying, what controls do we have in place? What policies and procedures can we sort of codify? And a lot of it is based on heightened sensitivity to, regulatory action,
Right.
right? And so investment in it's never enough. I mean, investment in in the kinds of systems we're talking about, it almost seems like it is never going to be enough. You have to keep, pushing the boundary, and every new incident that happens goes full
Yeah.
circle back. We got to report to our board, not every incident, but consolidated list of incidents that
Right.
have happened. I mean, that's a
Yes.
requirement. And
Yes.
so we have to immediately prepare to answer their questions on how are we preventing it. And that takes us back to how are we strengthening observability, how are we strengthening, support, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So I do see that in our business, particularly mine, this will be 50% of the energy that we spend.
Right.
So that's very substantial for us.
Very nice. But thank you so much for all these insights. One final question before I let you go. We generally ask every guest what are their favorite books that has really transformed and inspired them, right? If you can name one or two, and how did they inspired you?
Bharat, there's only one that comes to mind, because these days, it's hard to sort of finish a book, much less.
I,
But
I can
there's
understand.
one, there's one that I actually ended up finishing. It's a book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by
Okay.
an author called Robert Persig.
Right.
And I read it many years ago, couldn't finish it. And then I picked it up actually about a year ago, and I was hooked to it. And I think uh, it's a book that is very unique for me because it's, on the one hand, highly philosophical. On the other hand, it is highly driven by a notion of quality. And
Okay.
it's quite interesting the way the author brings about uh, very intensely the notion of quality and blends that with philosophy. So somewhat deep, I suppose, the way I'm saying it, but it worked for me.
Cool. No, no. Thank you so much, Vamsi. Thank you so much for your time and insights. It has always been great pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
The pleasure is likewise and mutual, Bharat. Always enjoy talking to you, Ashwin, and the rest of the team. So looking forward to more conversations.
Thank you. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider sharing it with colleagues who have similar interest. It will help us spread the word. For more information about VuNet systems, visit us at www.vunetsystems.com.